August 1942, Eagle Farm Airfield, Brisbane, Australia, a 3-year-old U.S. Army captain named Paul "Pappy" Gunn stood beside a B-25 Mitchell bomber with a welding torch and an idea that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force's manual. From 20,000 feet, Allied bombers were hitting Japanese ships 2 times out of every 100 bombs dropped, 2%. Meanwhile, enemy convoys delivered thousands of tons of supplies to New Guinea every month, and Gunn's wife and 4 children remained trapped in a Japanese internment camp in Manila. The doctrine said bombers attack from altitude. Gunn saw something different. He saw an empty nose that could hold 8 forward-firing machine guns. He saw a bomber that could fly like a fighter, low and fast, turning geometry into firepower. Without permission, without blueprints, Gunn began modifying B-25 seconds in the Australian heat, packing them with enough firepower to shred a ship's deck while skip-bombing its hull. By March 1943, his outlaws would face the ultimate test, a 16-ship Japanese convoy escorted by destroyers and 100 Zero fighters, carrying 6,900 troops that could extend the Pacific War by months. What happened in those 3 days over the Bismarck Sea would transform the bomber, the doctrine, and the mathematics of naval warfare forever. Could one man's illegal modifications rewrite the rules of combat and save an entire theater of war? Hit subscribe to keep these untold stories alive. The ones where courage and ingenuity rewrote history when the rulebook failed. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far the truth travels. August 1942. Northern Australia had become the fragile edge of the free world, a place where victory wasn't measured in territory gained, but in disasters prevented. Every morning, Allied intelligence officers in Port Moresby pinned fresh reconnaissance photographs to briefing room walls, and every morning those photographs told the same infuriating story. Japanese convoys moved with impunity through the waters north of New Guinea, their holds packed with troops, ammunition, and supplies that sustained an occupation threatening Australia itself. The Allied response had been relentless. B-17 flying fortresses climbed to 20,000 feet and released their bombs with mathematical precision. Bombardiers hunched over Norden bomb sites calibrated to account for altitude, wind speed, target velocity, and 17 other variables that had to align perfectly in the 4.8 seconds between release and impact. The results were documented with brutal clarity in mission reports filed throughout July and August. Hit rate: 2 bombs out of every 100 found their target, 2%. The other 98 raised geysers of white water that Japanese sailors watched from their decks before continuing south, their cargo intact, their mission uninterrupted. It wasn't a question of courage. American bomber crews flew through walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zero fighters to deliver those bombs. It was a question of geometry, and geometry was winning. Every ton of supplies that reached Lae or Buna meant another week of Japanese entrenchment, another Allied assault delayed, another calculation that the war in the Pacific might drag on for years. Paul Irvin Gunn understood those calculations in a way that made sleep impossible. At 43, he was old for a captain, old enough that younger pilots called him Pappy without irony. His official record listed him as U.S. Army Air Force's 3rd Bomb Group, but that single line compressed a life that had already spanned 2 careers. 20 years as a U.S. Navy chief and naval aviation pilot had given him 14,000 hours of civilian flight time and an engineer's instinct for how aircraft actually worked, not how manuals said they should work. He had retired from the Navy, moved to Manila, and built a quiet life as a civilian aviator. Then December 1941 shattered that life. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines, Gunn evacuated to Australia on one of the last flights out. His wife Polly and their 4 children, 3 daughters and a son, didn't make it. They were interned at Santo Tomas, a civilian prison camp in Manila where concrete walls and barbed wire now separated them from the world. Gunn had rejoined military service immediately, taking a commission as an Army captain with a single unspoken mission burning behind every decision he made. Every Japanese supply ship that reached New Guinea carried the troops and materials that sustained the occupation of the Philippines. Every ship he failed to sink extended the war, extended the occupation, extended the time his family spent behind those walls. The mathematics of aerial bombardment weren't just statistics to Gunn, they were a personal accounting of failure that compounded daily. August 1942, Eagle Farm Airfield outside Brisbane. Major General George Kenney had taken command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific with instructions from Douglas MacArthur that were both simple and impossible. Stop the Japanese supply line with whatever worked. Regulations optional. Kenney was 53, a veteran of the First World War, and he had learned that innovation happened fastest when talented people operated just beyond the reach of oversight. He had already watched Gunn successfully pack 4 50-caliber machine guns into the nose of an A-20 light bomber, an unauthorized modification that turned a medium attack aircraft into something that could strafe ground targets with devastating effect. The results impressed Kenney enough that he walked Gunn across the tarmac one afternoon and pointed at a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber sitting on the hardstand. The B-25 was a workhorse, reliable and tough, designed for medium-altitude bombing with a crew of 6 and a glazed nose section where the bombardier lay prone, peering through his bomb sight. Kenney asked a question that wasn't really a question. What if they flew bombers like fighters, low and fast, attacking ships from mast height instead of from 20,000 feet? Gunn stood there in the Queensland heat, staring at that B-25, and saw something that flight manuals and engineering specifications had never imagined. The nose was essentially empty space, built around one man and his bomb sight. But if you removed the bombardier, if you sealed that glass nose with metal and treated the entire front of the aircraft as a gun platform, you could mount enough forward-firing machine guns to turn the bomber into a flying battery. The recoil would be manageable. The weight distribution could be balanced. The firepower would be devastating. It was heresy against every principle of bomber doctrine, and Gunn started work that afternoon. He didn't wait for approval because approval would have meant committees and feasibility studies and engineering reviews that would consume months the war couldn't spare. Gunn salvaged 50-caliber machine guns from damaged aircraft, fabricated mounting brackets from scrap metal, and bolted 4 guns into a B-25's nose where the bombardier used to lie. The first test firing happened in a remote corner of Eagle Farm. The aircraft chocked and anchored while Gunn stood on the wing and fired long bursts into the Australian dirt. The recoil shook the airframe but didn't crack it. The guns fired in sequence without jamming. The alignment held true. Within 3 days, Gunn had a working prototype, and within 2 weeks he had convinced Major Ed Larner and Captain Jock Hennebrey to let him modify aircraft from their squadrons. His pitch was simple enough that mechanics and pilots understood it immediately. You could keep dropping bombs from 4 miles up and hoping geometry worked in your favor, or you could fly in low, put 8 machine guns on target, and remove uncertainty from the equation. By January 1943, Gunn and his small team had modified a handful of B-25 seconds without official authorization, each aircraft now mounting 8 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in the solid nose and 2 in custom blister packs on each side of the fuselage. The question that hung over Eagle Farm wasn't whether the modifications worked. The question was whether a 43-year-old mechanic with a welder and a personal vendetta had just reinvented what medium bombers could do, and whether the men who flew them would survive long enough to prove it. January 1943. The modifications that had begun as Pappy Gunn's private war against regulation were spreading through 5th Air Force squadrons with the uncontrolled momentum of an idea whose time had arrived through necessity rather than approval. Gunn didn't wait for engineering reports or procurement orders. He worked with what the war had already broken, salvaging machine guns from aircraft too damaged to fly, fabricating mounting hardware in machine shops that officially didn't have time for unauthorized projects, and convincing crews one squadron at a time that what looked like madness might actually be mathematics. Major Ed Larner commanded a B-25 squadron that had flown bombing missions by the book for 6 months and watched their ordnance raise fountains of seawater while Japanese transports steamed past untouched. When Gunn approached him with diagrams sketched on the back of requisition forms, Larner asked one question that mattered. Would this sink ships? Gunn's answer didn't involve probabilities or theoretical hit rates. He pointed at the 8 50 caliber machine guns he had already mounted in a test aircraft and said that at 250 miles per hour and 150 feet altitude, you didn't miss. You pointed the entire airplane at the target and held the trigger until the target stopped being a ship and became wreckage. Larner gave him 3 aircraft to modify and 2 weeks to prove the concept wouldn't kill his pilots before it killed the enemy. The engineering challenge wasn't just mounting guns. It was sustaining fire. A standard B-25 carried enough ammunition for defensive positions, waist guns, and a tail turret that fired in short bursts when fighters attacked. But Gunn's strafer concept required sustained forward fire. Long passes where all 8 nose guns hammered a target for 15 or 20 seconds at a time. The ammunition demand was staggering. Gunn stripped every non-essential item from the modified bombers, removed the bombardier station entirely to save 300 pounds, and fabricated custom ammunition feed systems that crammed belted 50 caliber rounds into every available space in the forward fuselage. He doubled the standard ammunition load and accepted that the weight distribution pushed the aircraft outside, calculated safety margins, documented in technical manuals written by engineers who had never considered that bombers might fight like this. The modified B-25 seconds were nose-heavy, harder to handle on takeoff, and absolutely unforgiving of pilot error. They were also capable of delivering more concentrated firepower in a single pass than an entire squadron of fighters, and that capability rewrote what crews thought possible. The 10th of February 1943. A formal complaint reached 5th Air Force Headquarters from engineering officers at Wright Field, the center of American aviation development, where wind tunnels and stress calculations determined what aircraft could and couldn't do. The complaint cited 3 specific violations: unauthorized airframe modification, a court-martial offense under wartime regulations, weight distribution outside calculated safety margins that invalidated the aircraft's airworthiness certification, lack of wind tunnel testing that meant the modified bombers were essentially experimental aircraft being flown in combat without proper evaluation. The complaint noted that if a modified B-25 suffered structural failure and killed its crew, the responsibility would fall on whoever had authorized the modifications, and since no one had officially authorized them, the responsibility would fall on Captain Paul Gunn. General George Kenney read the complaint in his office in Brisbane and called Gunn in for a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes. Kenney asked if anyone had been killed testing the modified aircraft. Gunn said not yet. Kenney told him to keep going and to keep it quiet and to make sure that when these strafers proved themselves in combat, they proved themselves so decisively that the engineering officers at Wright Field would have to rewrite their manuals instead of their complaints. The first combat test came in mid-February near Lae, where a small Japanese supply convoy had been spotted moving down the coast of New Guinea with an escort of patrol boats and the air cover of low clouds that made high-altitude bombing impossible. 3 of Gunn's modified B-25 seconds went in at mast height, their pilots holding formation as they closed on the lead transport at 250 miles per hour. The attack lasted 18 seconds. 8 forward-firing machine guns from each aircraft poured fire into the ship's bridge and deck, shredding the superstructure and killing anyone exposed topside before the pilots released their bombs and pulled up through smoke that smelled of burning oil and cordite. The bombs, released from 200 feet with 5-second delay fuses, skipped across the water like stones thrown flat, retaining their forward momentum until they struck the transport's hull below the waterline and detonated inside the ship where conventional bombs dropped from altitude never reached. The transport broke in half and sank within minutes. The second ship in the convoy took hits from two strafers and lost steering, circling uselessly while fires consumed its cargo holds. The third ship ran itself aground trying to escape, where it became a stationary target for follow-up strikes. 3 ships attacked, 3 ships destroyed, 0 Allied losses. The mission report was filed with language that tried to remain professional and factual, but the conclusion was impossible to soften. The modified bombers worked, and they worked with an efficiency that made every previous attack method look like practice runs that had cost tonnage and time the Allies couldn't afford. By month's end, Gunn had converted 12 B-25 seconds into strafers, each mounting 8 forward-firing guns and carrying double the standard ammunition load. Crews trained on wrecked barges in Oro Bay, learning to approach targets at wave-top height and hold their aircraft steady through the violence of 8 machine guns firing simultaneously. The experience was visceral in ways that high-altitude bombing never was. At 20,000 feet, a ship was an abstract shape, a target marked on a map. At 150 feet, you saw the faces of men on deck before your guns erased them. You felt the heat from burning fuel. You smelled the smoke. One pilot wrote in his log that you didn't aim a strafer, you pointed it, and what you pointed it at stopped existing in any organized way. Another pilot noted that this was 200 fewer enemy soldiers who would shoot at Australians tomorrow, and if that math seemed brutal, it was also accurate. The strafers were proving themselves in small engagements, convoy actions, and patrol boat attacks that demonstrated capability without answering the larger question that hung over every briefing. Could these modified bombers survive against a major convoy, against destroyers with coordinated anti-aircraft fire and dozens of Zero fighters flying escort? The answer to that question was moving south from Rabaul, and Allied intelligence was tracking it with mounting dread. Late February, 1943. The tactical revolution that Pappy Gunn had welded together in Australian machine shops was becoming doctrine faster than anyone had anticipated, spreading through bomber squadrons as crews who had flown the modified aircraft shared what they had learned with pilots who still flew by the book. Major Ed Larner, who commanded the first squadron to adopt the strafer modifications, began codifying Gunn's instinct into repeatable procedures that could be taught and practiced rather than improvised under fire. The technique had a name now, skip bombing, and it combined physics with violence in ways that conventional bombing doctrine had never imagined. The approach profile was simple enough to explain and terrifying to execute. Aircraft descended to mast height, somewhere between 50 and 200 feet above the water, close enough that pilots could see individual crewmen on enemy decks and feel the ship's heat radiating up through their cockpit glass. At 250 miles per hour, the B-25 seconds closed distance at a rate that gave defensive gunners seconds to react before 8 forward-firing machine guns opened fire, not to destroy the ship but to suppress every gun position, every anti-aircraft mount, and every exposed crew station that could return fire. The guns continued firing as the pilot released his bombs, 500-pound weapons fitted with 4 or 5-second delay fuses that prevented them from detonating on impact. Instead, the bombs retained their forward momentum, skipping across the water's surface once, twice, sometimes 3 times before striking the ship's hull below the waterline, where armor was thinnest and compartments were most vulnerable. The bombs detonated inside the ship, and ships that could absorb punishment from bombs dropped from 4 miles up came apart when explosions tore through their interiors. The training evolved at Oro Bay, where crews practiced on wrecked barges and derelict hulks that had been towed into position to serve as targets that couldn't shoot back. Pilots learned to hold their aircraft steady through the recoil of sustained fire, to judge release points by distance rather than bombsight calculations, and to pull up hard immediately after weapons release, because at 150 feet there was no room for hesitation. The experience changed men in ways that high-altitude bombing never had. At 20,000 feet, combat was abstract, enemy ships reduced to shapes on the ocean that disappeared beneath clouds and bomb bursts. At mast height, combat became intimate and immediate. You saw faces. You saw men running for cover. You saw the exact moment when machine gun fire turned a ship's bridge into debris and human beings into casualties. One pilot logged a single sentence after his first training run that captured what the others felt but couldn't articulate. You see faces on deck before you fire, then you don't see faces. The psychological weight of that proximity, of killing at a range where the results were visible and undeniable, separated some crews from the mission before they ever faced actual combat. Others accepted it with the logic that Gunn had stated from the beginning, without sympathy but with accuracy. Every Japanese soldier killed on a transport ship was one fewer shooting at Allied troops on the ground, one fewer prolonging a war that was consuming lives at a rate that made individual mercy a luxury the mathematics couldn't support. The danger of low-level attack wasn't theoretical. Flying at 150 feet in combat eliminated the safety margin that altitude provided. Engine failure, anti-aircraft hits, or a moment of pilot error at that height meant no time to recover, no opportunity to bail out, just impact. Training accidents happened. Aircraft clipped waves during practice runs and cartwheeled across the water, breaking apart and killing crews who had survived months of high-altitude missions only to die learning a new way to fight. Early combat missions saw strafers damaged by their own bomb blasts when pilots released too late or pulled up too slow, the delayed fuses no protection when shrapnel from explosions 200 feet away could puncture fuel tanks and sever control cables. Crews started calling it mast height roulette, and the name stuck because it was accurate. You got in low, you delivered your ordnance, and you got out. And whether you survived depended on skill, timing, and variables you couldn't control. The modified B-25 seconds gave crews overwhelming offensive capability, but they didn't make the crews invulnerable, and the losses accumulated in ways that forced everyone involved to confront a question that had no comfortable answer. How many aircraft and crews were you willing to lose to prove that strafer tactics could win battles that conventional bombing couldn't? By late February, 18 B-25 seconds had been modified to gun specifications, mounting 8 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns, and carrying ammunition loads that let them sustain fire for full combat runs. 54 pilots had been trained in skip bombing, along with 216 aircrew who served as co-pilots, engineers, and gunners on aircraft that now fought more like fighters than bombers. The tactical manual updates that would have formalized the doctrine and distributed it across the entire 5th Air Force hadn't been written yet, not because commanders doubted the effectiveness, but because the speed of events had outpaced the administrative machinery that turned battlefield innovation into official procedure. The strafer modifications existed in a strange operational space, neither fully authorized nor officially prohibited, effective enough that General Kenny protected them from engineering complaints but untested enough that their true capability remained unknown. Small convoy actions and patrol boat engagements had proven the concept worked. Modified bombers could sink ships with efficiency that conventional attacks couldn't match. But those engagements had involved minimal opposition, lightly armed vessels without coordinated air cover, targets that didn't represent the real threat moving through Pacific waters. The ultimate test required a defended convoy, destroyers with experienced crews and concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and a force of 0 fighters large enough to overwhelm any escort the Allies could provide. That test was approaching from the north, and the intelligence photographs that reached Port Moresby on February 28 made it clear that everything Gunn had built, every modification he had welded and every crew he had trained, was about to face validation or annihilation in a battle that would decide whether strafer doctrine survived beyond March 1943. The convoy no one could stop was 6 hours out of Rabaul, and it was bringing an army. The 28th of February 1943, 2:30 the afternoon. An Allied reconnaissance B-24 photographed what intelligence officers would later designate Operation 81, 16 ships in formation departing Simpson Harbor at Rabaul, steaming south toward the Vitiaz Strait and the New Guinea coast beyond. The photographs were developed in a mobile darkroom, rushed to Port Moresby, and placed on General George Kenny's desk before sunset, and what they revealed was the largest Japanese convoy operation in the Southwest Pacific since the war began. 8 transport ships, each displacing between 6,000 and 7,000 tons, moved in 2 columns with disciplined spacing that spoke to experienced seamanship and serious intent. 8 destroyers provided escort, positioned in a protective screen around the transports with overlapping fields of fire that would make any air attack costly. The convoy's composition told half the story. The other half came from decoded radio intercepts that cryptanalysts delivered alongside the photographs, and those intercepts detailed cargo manifests with precision that eliminated any doubt about what the Japanese were attempting. The transports carried 6,900 combat troops from the 51st Division, a formation that had fought in China and earned a reputation for effectiveness that Allied intelligence respected. Beyond the troops, the manifests listed thousands of tons of ammunition, artillery pieces, vehicles, medical supplies, and everything required to sustain offensive operations for months. This wasn't a resupply mission, it was an invasion force, and its destination was Lae, the Japanese stronghold on New Guinea's northern coast that served as the anchor for their entire position in the region. The strategic mathematics were straightforward and terrifying. If this convoy reached Lae intact, Japan would gain the combat power to launch a renewed offensive toward Port Moresby, the last major Allied base in New Guinea and the shield protecting Australia from direct invasion. Allied intelligence analysts ran the calculations and delivered estimates that extended timelines no one wanted to see. A reinforced Lae meant months of additional fighting, tens of thousands of additional casualties, and a realistic possibility that Japan could regain initiative in a theater where the Allies had only recently stopped losing ground. The convoy represented more than tactical supplies. It represented strategic momentum, and momentum in 1943 was the resource that mattered more than tonnage or troop numbers. Whoever controlled momentum controlled the pace of the war, and Operation 81 was Japan's attempt to seize that control back from an Allied command that had spent 6 months learning how to fight in the Pacific through accumulated disasters and hard-won adaptation. The photographs on Kenny's desk showed 16 ships that, if destroyed, would eliminate an entire division's worth of combat power before it ever reached shore. If those ships completed their voyage, every subsequent Allied operation in New Guinea would face an enemy force stronger, better supplied, and positioned to contest ground that had cost thousands of lives to reach. The 1st of March 1943, before dawn, the pre-mission briefing at Port Moresby assembled every available bomber crew and fighter pilot in the 5th Air Force, a gathering large enough that it filled a hangar and spilled out onto the tarmac where men stood in the tropical darkness listening to intelligence officers describe a target that seemed designed to test whether Allied air power could actually stop a determined enemy at sea. The strike force that Kenny committed represented everything he had. B-17 flying fortresses would attack first from medium altitude, attempting to break the convoy's formation and damage ships before the low-level strafers went in. A-20 light bombers and Australian Beaufighters would suppress anti-aircraft fire, their forward guns clearing the way for the modified B-25 seconds that would deliver the killing strikes with skip bombing runs coordinated to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer concentration. P-38 Lightning fighters would provide top cover against the estimated 100 Zero fighters that Japanese command had stationed at airfields along the convoy route, and those P-38 seconds would be outnumbered but positioned to intercept bombers' most vulnerable approach and egress routes. The plan assumed cooperation between American and Australian units that had been fighting separately for months, assumed that weather would permit visual attacks, and assumed that crews trained for weeks could execute under fire against an enemy force that would be fighting for survival with every weapon they possessed. Kenny knew that assumptions were where battle plans failed, but he also knew that this convoy was too important to allow safe passage, and if the strafers couldn't prove their worth now against this target, then the modifications that Gunn had built would remain an interesting experiment that hadn't changed the war. Pappy Gunn wouldn't fly the mission. At 43, with his unique engineering knowledge and his ability to keep modified aircraft operational under field conditions, he was too valuable to risk in combat, a calculation that felt like cowardice to a man whose family remained imprisoned 1,500 miles north. Kenny made the decision personally and enforced it over Gunn's objections, and so, on the morning of March 2, Gunn would stand on the tarmac at Port Moresby and watch other men take his modifications into the battle that would validate or condemn everything he had built. Crew logs from the night of March 1 record unusual silence during final preparations, the absence of the dark humor and casual profanity that usually accompanied pre-mission hours. One pilot vomited behind his aircraft and returned to pre-flight checks without commenting on it. Another wrote a letter to his mother and left it in his footlocker with instructions to mail it if he didn't return, a precaution he hadn't taken before any previous mission. The target was 215 nautical miles away, far enough that fuel margins allowed only 18 minutes over the combat zone before aircraft would need to turn for home or risk ditching in ocean controlled by an enemy that machine-gun survivors in the water. 18 minutes to locate, attack, and destroy a convoy defended by 8 destroyers and 100 fighters, and then 215 miles back to base if your aircraft wasn't too damaged to make the flight. March 2 morning. A weather front moved across the Bismarck Sea, delaying the strike and advancing the convoy closer to Leh with every hour lost. The Japanese formation was making steady progress, and every mile gained meant the attack window narrowed and the return flight lengthened over jungle where downed crews would face capture or death without the possibility of rescue. The delay gave crews additional time to consider what they were about to attempt, and that additional time didn't improve confidence. The odds were documented in briefing folders that listed enemy strength with intelligence precision. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, estimated 100 fighters, against 90 Allied bombers and fighters that would be attacking in waves because fuel capacity prevented simultaneous strikes. The mathematics suggested that some aircraft wouldn't return, and the only questions were how many and whether their loss would be justified by the damage they inflicted. The answer to those questions was moving south through clouded seas, and the weather was breaking. The 2nd of March 1943, 0 inches the afternoon. The first wave of B-17 Flying Fortresses found the convoy 60 miles north of Cape Gloucester, 16 ships maintaining formation in seas rough enough to make anti-aircraft fire less accurate, but not rough enough to provide real protection. The B-17 seconds attacked from 5,000 feet, medium altitude chosen to balance bombing accuracy against defensive fire, and the results demonstrated both the capability and limitations of conventional tactics against a defended target. Bombs fell in patterns calculated to bracket the transports, and one hit struck the Kyokusei Maru amidships, the explosion tearing through cargo holds packed with ammunition and fuel that detonated in a secondary blast visible from 20 miles away. The transport broke apart and sank within 8 minutes, taking 950 troops and tons of supplies down with it. Another transport, the Teiyo Maru, took near misses that damaged steering and forced it to reduce speed, falling behind the convoy formation and becoming isolated. The attack cost 1 B-17, shot down by concentrated anti-aircraft fire from the destroyer screen. 5 men killed when the bomber hit the water and broke apart. The convoy's formation scattered, ships maneuvering independently to avoid additional bombing runs, and that dispersion would prove fatal because concentrated defensive fire depended on ships maintaining supporting positions where their anti-aircraft coverage overlapped. By sunset on March 2, the convoy was damaged but functional, one transport sunk and another crippled, 14 ships still capable of reaching Leh if they survived the night, and the attacks that would come with daylight on March 3. The 3rd of March 1943, dawn. The main strike launched from Port Moresby with coordination that had been planned for days and rehearsed in briefings that tried to account for every variable except the ones that would matter most when aircraft actually engaged. Australian Beaufighters went in first, twin-engine heavy fighters mounting 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns in the nose. Aircraft designed for exactly this kind of suppression mission. They came in at mast height, their approach so low that Japanese gunners tracking them had to depress their weapons to angles that limited traverse and rate of fire. The Beaufighters opened fire at 800 yards, their cannons punching through ship superstructures and destroying gun mounts before defensive crews could bring concentrated fire to bear. The attack lasted 90 seconds, long enough to kill or suppress dozens of anti-aircraft positions and short enough that the Beaufighters cleared the target area before the destroyers could coordinate a killing response. Behind them, 13 B-25 strafers descended to attack altitude, and what happened next would be described in after-action reports with language that struggled to remain professional when the reality was slaughter conducted with industrial efficiency. The strafers came in line abreast, 13 aircraft spread across 2,000 yards of ocean, each bomber mounting 8 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns that opened fire simultaneously at 600 yards range. The combined firepower was over 100 machine guns firing at cyclic rate, 80,000 rounds per minute directed at ships that had already been suppressed by the Beaufighter attack and were now facing destruction delivered at 250 miles per hour from aircraft that closed distance faster than gun crews could track. Pilot testimony from Lieutenant Edward Scott, recorded 3 days after the battle, captured what conventional language couldn't. You don't aim, you point the entire airplane. At that height, you feel the mast heat. You smell the smoke. The strafers walked their fire across the transports, machine guns shredding deck crews, destroying bridge structures, and eliminating any organized resistance before the pilots released their bombs. The 500-pound weapons skipped across wave tops, retained their forward momentum, and struck ship hulls below the waterline where the explosions opened the vessels to the sea. The destroyer Shirayuki, attempting to position itself between the strafers and the transports, took multiple bomb hits that detonated in its engine room and magazine. The destroyer exploded with enough force that debris rained down on surrounding ships, and it sank in less than 3 minutes, so fast that most of its crew had no time to abandon ship. The transports died methodically. The Teo Maru, already damaged from the previous day's attack, took 4 skip bomb hits that opened its hull from bow to stern. It capsized within 6 minutes, trapping hundreds of troops below decks. The Shinai Maru burned after machine gun fire ignited fuel stores, and the fire spread faster than damage control parties could contain it, forcing the crew to abandon a ship that would burn for 3 hours before sinking. The Ayo Maru broke in half after a bomb detonated in a cargo hold packed with artillery shells, the explosion so violent that ships a mile away took shrapnel damage. One by one, the transports that had departed Rabaul with 6,900 troops and the supplies to sustain offensive operations became burning wrecks or debris fields spreading across the Bismarck Sea. Japanese destroyers attempted to screen the surviving transports, laying smoke and maneuvering to block attack runs, but the strafer doctrine that Gunn had developed specifically countered concentrated defenses. The modified B-25 seconds didn't need extended time over target. They made single high-speed passes, delivered their ordnance, and were gone before defensive fire could track them effectively. The attack pattern repeated throughout the morning as successive waves of Allied aircraft found targets that couldn't maneuver, couldn't hide, and couldn't survive the volume of fire being directed at them from altitudes where every round found its mark. The 4th of March 1943. Mop-up strikes hunted the remaining crippled vessels that had survived the previous day's annihilation but lacked the speed or structural integrity to reach port. PT boats from Milne Bay joined the hunt. their torpedoes finishing off transports that were already settling by the bow or listing so badly that abandonment was inevitable. Allied aircraft strafed lifeboats and rafts carrying Japanese survivors, attacks that violated maritime tradition, and were defended by commanders who noted that every soldier who reached shore would require Allied lives to defeat in subsequent ground combat. The moral accounting of those attacks would be debated for decades, but the tactical accounting was documented with precision. 8 Japanese transports sunk, all of them. 4 destroyers sunk out of 8 committed. Japanese troops killed, approximately 2,890. Japanese troops who reached land, approximately 1,200, without weapons, without supplies, and without the combat effectiveness that would have made them a strategic threat. Allied aircraft lost, 5 total. Allied aircrew killed, 13 men. The mathematics of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea were brutal and one-sided, a victory so complete that it effectively ended Japan's ability to reinforce New Guinea by sea and validated the strafer modifications that had begun 7 months earlier with Pappy gun and a welding torch at Eagle Farm. The 6th of March, 1943. General Douglas MacArthur's communiqué described the battle as the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific, language that would prove accurate when historians examined Japan's strategic options after March 1943 and found them systematically eliminated by the destruction of Operation 81. March 10, General Kenny issued orders that made guns modifications official doctrine. All 5th Air Force B-25 seconds would receive the strafer package, 8 forward-firing guns, and the ammunition capacity to sustain combat at mast height. The outlaw experiment had become standard procedure, and the transformation it enabled would sink over 1 million tons of Japanese shipping before the war ended, crippling an empire that depended on maritime logistics and couldn't replace what Allied strafers destroyed faster than it could be built.